I stood in that lawyer's office, my weathered hands trembling as I held the envelope that would shatter everything my family thought they knew about me. The mahogany conference table stretched between us like a chasm that had been widening for decades. My 3 children sat across from me, their faces wearing that familiar expression of polite impatience I'd grown so accustomed to over the years. The same expression they'd worn on Christmas morning 8 months ago, the same one they displayed whenever they visited my house and sat checking their phones while I tried to tell them about my week. David kept checking his phone, his manicured fingers dancing across the screen with the urgency of someone whose time was far too valuable to waste on family formalities. Every few seconds his eyes would dart to his Rolex, a gift from his law firm when he made partner. At 48 he had the sharp, efficient look of a man who measured his life in billable hours and quarterly profits. Sarah was already calculating numbers in her head. I could tell by the way her lips moved slightly, the same habit she'd had since she was 7 years old doing math homework at our kitchen table. At 46 she wore the carefully maintained appearance of a suburban mother who had turned child-rearing into a competitive sport, complete with designer handbags that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. And Michael couldn't even look at me directly. At 43 my youngest had perfected the art of being physically present while emotionally absent. He stared out the window at the parking lot, his jaw set in that stubborn line that told me he considered this entire proceeding an unwelcome interruption to his important life in California. They think this is just a formality, I thought, watching them fidget in their expensive suits and designer handbags. They think they know exactly what's coming. Poor old Mom, leaving us her modest savings in that old house with the creaky floors and outdated kitchen. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here they were, finally giving me their undivided attention. Well, as much attention as they were capable of giving anyone other than themselves. The last time we'd all been in the same room was Christmas morning, 8 months ago. 8 months since they'd rushed through gift exchanges like they were checking items off a grocery list. 8 months since David had answered 3 work calls during dinner. 8 months since Sarah had spent the entire day managing her children's schedules with military precision, leaving no room for the kind of meandering conversation that might include their grandmother. 8 months since they'd made it crystal clear that their lives were too busy, too important, too full to have space for a 73-year-old woman who had apparently outlived her usefulness. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, had been my secret for 37 years. Not once had any of them asked where I went on those Tuesday afternoons when I dressed up in my good clothes and drove downtown. Not once had they wondered why their simple grandmother, who supposedly never did anything important, might need a lawyer. Not once had they questioned the source of the money that had paid for the house renovations, the new car every few years, the trips to Europe that I took alone after their father died. They saw what they expected to see. A lonely widow living on Social Security and savings, puttering around an empty house, waiting for their occasional phone calls like scraps thrown to a grateful dog. "Before we begin," Mr. Patterson said, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade, "I want to make it clear that Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell was very specific about how this reading should proceed." I watched David's jaw tighten, that little muscle that pulsed when he was annoyed but trying to maintain professional composure. Even now, even at my supposed final moment, he couldn't hide his irritation at having to be here instead of at his office, making money, building his empire, living his important life. The last conversation I'd had with David had been 3 weeks ago, when I'd called to tell him about the neighbor's cat that had been visiting my garden. I'd thought it was a sweet story, the way this orange tabby had adopted me, coming to my back door every morning for food and companionship. David had listened for exactly 30 seconds before interrupting. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something here. Can we talk about this later?" Later never came, of course. It never did. Sarah was checking her phone under the table, probably coordinating pickup times for Emma's dance lessons or James's soccer practice. At Christmas she'd shown me their family calendar, a color-coded masterpiece of scheduled activities that left precisely no room for spontaneous visits to grandmothers or leisurely phone calls about neighborhood cats. Michael hadn't called me in 6 months. 6 months of silence from my youngest child, broken only by a perfunctory text on Mother's Day. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom. Hope you're well. Hope you're well." As if my wellness was something he genuinely wondered about but couldn't be bothered to actually inquire into. The envelope in my hands contained more than just my final wishes. It contained the truth about the life I'd been living parallel to theirs for decades. The truth about the woman they'd never bothered to really see, the accomplishments they'd never thought to ask about, the respect I'd earned in circles they didn't even know existed. If only they knew, I thought, if only they knew that the woman they've been humoring with their dutiful holiday visits, the woman they see as just their aging mother who bakes cookies and asks too many questions about their lives. If only they knew who I really am. They were about to find out. The envelope contained documents that would prove, beyond any shadow of doubt, that they had been wrong about everything. Wrong about my capabilities, wrong about my intelligence, wrong about my worth, wrong about the scope and significance of my life. Most painfully, they had been wrong about loving me. Because you can't truly love someone you refuse to see, and they had stopped seeing me years ago. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Eleanor Margaret Hartwell and I am 73 years old. When I look at my hands now, spread flat against the mahogany table in that lawyer's office, I see the map of a life fully lived. These fingers have changed thousands of diapers during those sleepless early years when each of my babies seemed determined to test my endurance. They've written countless love letters to Robert during his deployment in Vietnam, when we were newlyweds and I was pregnant with David, terrified and alone in a little apartment above the hardware store. These same hands have signed important documents my children never knew existed, balanced ledgers that would make their accountants weep with envy, and wiped away more tears than any woman should have to shed, my own and others, during the years when I became the person people turned to when their financial worlds were falling apart. The wedding ring I've worn for 51 years sits a little loose now, spinning when I'm nervous, which I was terribly on that September morning in the lawyer's office. The ring has worn a permanent groove in my finger. A circle of pale skin that tells the story of decades spent as Robert's wife, my children's mother, a woman whose identity was so thoroughly intertwined with caring for others that I almost forgot I existed as a separate person. Almost, but not quite. I wasn't always the invisible woman sitting across from my children that day. There was a time when I was Eleanor Margaret Donovan, 22 years old, with thick auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire and dreams that stretched far beyond the small town of Millbrook where I was born. I remember standing in my childhood bedroom in 1972, wearing a dress I'd sewn myself from fabric bought with babysitting money, filling out applications for college scholarships while my mother called from downstairs that I was getting too big for my britches. My mother, God rest her soul, believed that education beyond high school was wasted on girls who would just get married and have babies anyway. She couldn't understand why I wanted to study mathematics and business when I could learn everything I needed to know about being a wife and mother right there at home. Eleanor Margaret, she used to say, you've got stars in your eyes and rocks in your head. No man wants a wife who thinks she's smarter than he is. But I did think I was smart. I knew I was smart. I could calculate compound interest in my head while other girls my age were struggling with basic arithmetic. I could look at my father's farm ledgers and spot discrepancies that he'd missed. When the local bank made an error in our family's account, I was the one who caught it and made them correct it, despite being only 17 years old. Funny how memory works, I often think now. How it preserves the moments that mattered even when the world around you decides they didn't. But then I met Robert Hartwell at the county fair that summer and everything changed. Not in the fairy tale way young women dream about, but in the quiet, gradual way that real life reshapes your plans without asking permission. Robert was handsome in that reliable way that mothers approve of, with steady hands that could fix anything and eyes that promised security in an uncertain world. He was 24, just back from his tour in Vietnam, working at the Millbrook manufacturing plant and saving money to buy his own house. When he asked me to dance to a Patsy Cline song at the fair's makeshift dance floor, I felt something shift inside me, not just attraction but recognition. Here was a man who looked at me like I mattered, like my thoughts and dreams were worth hearing. When he asked me to marry him 6 months later, kneeling in my parents' front parlor with a small diamond ring he'd saved 3 months to buy, I said yes because I loved him, but also because 1973 didn't offer many other respectable paths for a girl from my background. You got married or you became a teacher or a nurse. And even then you were expected to quit when you had children. I chose love, but I also chose the path of least resistance. We had 34 good years together, Robert and I. Not perfect years, but good ones filled with the kind of steady affection that grows deeper rather than more passionate with time. We built a life in the same small town where I'd grown up, in a house with blue shutters and a garden that I tended every morning before the rest of the world woke up. We raised 3 children in that house. David in 1975, Sarah in 1977 and Michael in 1980. Each birth was a miracle that left me exhausted and exhilarated, overwhelmed by the fierce protectiveness I felt for these small people who depended entirely on me for everything. I was the mother who made Halloween costumes from scratch, spending weeks sewing elaborate outfits that would make my children the envy of their classmates. I was the mother who knew every teacher's name, every classmate's birthday, every detail of their academic and social lives. I never missed a school play or soccer game, even when it meant leaving work early or rearranging my schedule. I was the wife who had dinner ready at 6 sharp, who kept the house spotless despite having 3 active children and a husband who tracked mud through the kitchen every day. I made sure Robert's shirts were pressed and his coffee was strong, that his favorite dessert was waiting after particularly hard days at the plant. But I was also something else, something I kept hidden, tucked away like a secret garden that bloomed only when no one was watching. I was the woman who balanced our family's books with mathematical precision that impressed our accountant. I was the woman who researched every major purchase for months, comparing prices and reading consumer reports until I could make decisions that saved us thousands of dollars over the years. I was the woman who, when the plant where Robert worked went through layoffs in 1982, quietly took a part-time job at Morrison's accounting to help make ends meet, and discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of financial planning that most people with business degrees lacked. The children see me now as their aging mother who needs help opening jars and who repeats stories they've heard before. They don't see the woman who once stood up at a town council meeting in 1995 and delivered a speech about municipal budget allocation that changed local policy and saved taxpayers $200,000 annually. They don't see the woman who even now reads the Wall Street Journal every morning along with 2 local newspapers, who can discuss international monetary policy with more depth and nuance than most people half my age. They see me as someone whose life began and ended with them, whose purpose was fulfilled when they grew up and moved away, whose remaining years are just a slow decline toward irrelevance. And for the longest time I let them. I let them see me as the simple grandmother who baked cookies and sent birthday cards and asked too many questions about their lives during our increasingly rare phone calls. I let them believe that my world was small and quiet and centered entirely around their occasional visits. I never told them about the business I built from nothing, or the clients who trusted me with their life savings, or the awards I'd won for excellence in financial planning. I never mentioned the speaking engagements or the articles I'd written for industry publications or the young women who sought my mentorship. Why didn't I tell them? The honest answer is that for years I tried. But they weren't interested in hearing about their mother's accomplishments. They wanted me to be proud of theirs, to ask questions about their work and their children and their important lives. When I tried to share my own news, I was met with polite disinterest or gentle condescension. "That's nice, Mom," followed by an immediate change of subject. "Good for you, Mom," said in the tone you'd use to praise a child's finger painting. Eventually I stopped trying. It was easier to let them see what they expected to see than to keep fighting for recognition that would never come. But in that lawyer's office, with Patterson's carefully prepared documents spread across the mahogany table, they were finally going to meet the real Eleanor Hartwell. The woman they'd been ignoring for decades. The forgetting started slowly the way most heartbreaks do. It wasn't dramatic or sudden like the betrayals you read about in novels or see in movies. There was no single moment when my children decided I was no longer worth their full attention, no conscious choice to exclude me from their lives. Instead, it happened like erosion, gradual and almost imperceptible until one day you look up and realize that something that was once solid and dependable has simply disappeared. David was always the achiever even as a little boy. I remember finding him at age 7 in his bedroom, having organized his entire collection of toy cars by color, size, and manufacturer, his small face serious with concentration as he explained his system to me. "It's more efficient this way, Mom," he'd said, and I'd been both proud and slightly worried about a 7-year-old who used words like efficient. I should have seen what was coming. When he told me at 16 that he was going to law school and then into corporate finance, I wasn't surprised. David saw the world as a series of problems to be solved, inefficiencies to be corrected, and he was very good at solving problems. What I didn't anticipate was that as he climbed higher in his career, he would begin to see our family conversations as inefficiencies too. The change began during his senior year of college. Our weekly phone calls, which had been easy and meandering during his freshman and sophomore years, became more businesslike. He would tell me about his grades, his internship applications, his post-graduation plans, but when I tried to share news about home or ask follow-up questions about his life, I could sense his impatience. "Mom, can you get to the point?" became his standard response whenever I called with anything that wasn't directly related to his immediate needs. I told myself it was just the stress of senior year, then the pressure of starting his career, then the demands of making partner at his law firm. But the truth was simpler and more painful. David had outgrown me. By his 30s, our weekly phone calls had shrunk to monthly, then to holidays only. When I tried to tell him about the book I was reading or something interesting I'd heard on the news, I could practically hear him checking his email on the other end of the line. I remember one conversation in particular, sometime around 2008, when I called to tell him about a documentary I'd seen about the financial crisis. I'd found it fascinating, had taken notes, and wanted to discuss the implications with someone who understood economics. "Mom," he interrupted after about 30 seconds, "I live this stuff every day. The last thing I want to do when I get home is talk about work." That was when I realized I had become work to him. Something to be managed efficiently and concluded quickly so he could move on to more important things. The phone calls became increasingly scripted after that. He would ask about my health, the weather, whether I was keeping busy. When I answered, he would make appropriate noises of acknowledgement while clearly doing something else. Then he would update me on his career achievements, his children's milestones, his wife's activities. A neat, tidy report that required no real engagement from either of us. I became an agenda item, I realized one day after a particularly brief call. Something to be checked off his list so he could move on to more important things. Sarah took a different path, but the destination was the same. She married young to a man named Craig who sold insurance and spoke in the kind of cheerful cliches that made my teeth ache. They had 2 children quickly, Emma in 2001 and James in 2003, and Sarah threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she'd once brought to high school drama club. For a while this brought us closer. She would call me several times a week for advice about sleepless nights and teething troubles and the million small emergencies that come with babies. I felt useful again, needed. My experience as a mother was suddenly valuable, relevant to her life. I would drive the 45 minutes to their house every week, bringing casseroles that could be frozen for busy nights and offering to babysit so Sarah and Craig could have date nights. Those were good years when I was Grandma Ellie and my presence was welcomed, even cherished. I should have known it couldn't last. As Emma and James grew older, something shifted. Sarah became competitive about motherhood in a way that left no room for my experience or wisdom. When I suggested that maybe 4-year-old Emma didn't need quite so many structured activities, Sarah's voice would grow cold. "Times are different now, Mom," she would say, and the subtext was clear. "Your way of doing things is outdated. Irrelevant. Possibly even harmful." When I offered to take the children for a weekend so Sarah could rest, she would decline politely but firmly. "We have them enrolled in swimming lessons, music classes and soccer practice. Their schedules are pretty full." Her children's schedules were full. My schedule was empty. But somehow we couldn't find a way to make those two facts work together. The invitations to family dinners became less frequent. When I did visit, I found myself sitting in the corner while Sarah orchestrated elaborate weekend activities that had no space for a grandmother who might disrupt the carefully planned flow. My offers to help with meals or housework were politely declined. My stories about their father, whom Emma and James barely remembered, were met with distracted nods and quick subject changes. "Mom, you've told that story before," became Sarah's standard response to any anecdote about Robert or their childhoods. Had I told it before? Maybe. But wasn't that what grandmothers did? Wasn't the repetition of family stories part of how children learned who they were, where they came from? Apparently not. Apparently my stories were just noise cluttering up their efficient modern lives. By the time Emma turned 10 and James 8, I had been relegated to the role of gift giver and occasional babysitter. I was welcome at birthday parties and holidays, expected to bring presents and effusive praise for their achievements, but my actual presence had become optional. I became a decoration, I realized. Present but not really there. Michael's rejection was perhaps the most painful because it was the most honest. He never pretended to value my presence or sought my advice. From the time he was 18, he made it clear that he saw our family as something to escape from rather than embrace. Even as a child, Michael had been different from his siblings. Where David was driven and Sarah was social, Michael was introspective, artistic, always slightly apart from the rest of us. He spent hours in his room drawing elaborate fantasy worlds, reading science fiction novels, learning to code on the computer we'd bought when he turned 15. I thought his distance was just typical teenage behavior, that he would grow out of it as he matured. Instead, it deepened. He moved to California for college and stayed there, building a life in tech that I never fully understood and that he never bothered to explain. He would call on Christmas and Mother's Day, brief conversations filled with updates about his job and girlfriend that felt more like reports to a distant relative than conversations with his mother. "I'm just really busy, Mom," he would say whenever I suggested a visit. "Maybe next year." Next year never came. The few times I did see him, when he reluctantly flew home for Robert's funeral, for David's wedding, for Sarah's milestone birthday party, he was polite but remote. He would answer questions about his life in California with minimal detail, ask perfunctory questions about my health and activities, and spend most of his time texting or checking his phone. It was like being visited by a polite stranger who happened to share my DNA. When I tried to connect with him on topics I thought might interest him, technology, current events, books, his responses were brief and dismissive. Not rude exactly, but clearly uninterested in engaging with anything I had to say. "That's cool, Mom," he would say, then immediately change the subject or excuse himself to make a phone call. The message was clear. I had nothing to offer him. My thoughts, my opinions, my attempts at connection were unwelcome intrusions into his real life. The truth was, all three of my children had grown up and decided, consciously or unconsciously, that I was no longer relevant to their lives. I had served my purpose. I had raised them, supported them, launched them into their own futures. And now I was simply a responsibility to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. They were kind about it, mostly. They remembered my birthday and Mother's Day. They called when they were supposed to call, visited when social obligation demanded it. But their kindness was the distant kind you show to elderly relatives you barely know, not the warm intimacy you'd expect between a mother and her adult children. I had become a stranger in my own family. Robert's death in 2007 should have brought us closer together. For a brief moment it seemed like it might. All three children came home for the funeral, stayed for several days afterward, helped me sort through his belongings and make arrangements with insurance companies and banks. During those first weeks of grief I felt like I had my children back. They called regularly, stopped by without being asked, and seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. David helped me understand Robert's pension benefits. Sarah brought meals and helped me organize his clothes for donation. Michael, surprisingly, was the one who sat with me in the evenings when the house felt too quiet and empty. I thought this tragedy might be the thing that reminded them they still had a parent worth loving. But within months, it became clear that they saw Robert's death as the end of their real family, and me as a leftover obligation to be managed. "You should think about downsizing, Mom," David said 6 months after we buried his father. "This house is too big for you now. Too big for me now." As if I had somehow shrunk along with my family, as if I needed less space to exist now that I was alone. Sarah suggested I join the senior center, to meet people in similar situations. Michael, calling from California, wondered if I'd considered moving to a retirement community where I'd have built-in social activities. They were trying to solve the problem of me, trying to find an institutional setting where someone else could take responsibility for my care and feeding so they could get back to their important lives. None of them asked what I wanted. None of them wondered if I might have my own plans, my own purposes, my own reasons for staying in the house where I'd raised them and built a life. They saw me as a problem to be solved, not a person with agency and desires of my own. But here's what they didn't know, what they never bothered to discover in all their efficient phone calls and dutiful holiday visits. I hadn't shrunk at all. While they were building their busy, important lives, I was building something too. Something that started as a small project born from loneliness and grew into something that would shock them to their cores. I was building an empire. The business began in 1987, the year Sarah graduated high school. I remember that summer with particular clarity because it marked the beginning of what I privately called my empty nest years, though the nest wasn't completely empty yet. Michael was still in 8th grade. But David was already in college. Sarah was preparing for her freshman year at the state university. And suddenly the house felt vast and quiet during the days when Robert was at work and Michael was with friends. For 18 years, my identity had been wrapped up in the daily tasks of motherhood. Making lunches, supervising homework, driving to practices and games, volunteering for school events. Suddenly, those tasks were disappearing, and I found myself with hours to fill and no clear purpose to guide me. That's when I remembered who I used to be. I had always been good with numbers. It was something my father had recognized when I was still in elementary school, teaching me to help with the farm's books during long winter evenings. But I'd set aside those skills when I became a wife and mother, the way women of my generation did. We were expected to find fulfillment in supporting our husbands' careers and raising our children, not in pursuing our own ambitions. That fall, I decided to take a part-time job at Morrison's accounting firm, just to have something to do with my days. Harold Morrison was an old friend of Robert's from high school, and he needed help organizing files and answering phones during tax season. It was supposed to be temporary just until I figured out what to do with myself. But Harold Morrison saw something in me that my own family never did. Within the first month, he noticed that I was organizing his filing system in ways that made everything more efficient. I had identified patterns in his client base that he'd never noticed, suggested improvements to his record-keeping that saved him hours of work each week. "Eleanor," he said one day watching me streamline his appointment scheduling system, "you've got a mind for this kind of work. Have you ever thought about learning to prepare tax returns?" I had thought about it actually. I'd been thinking about it for years. Within 6 months, Harold was teaching me the basics of tax preparation. Within a year, I was handling simple returns for his smaller clients. Within 3 years, I was taking courses at the community college, driving there twice a week in the evenings while Robert watched television and assumed I was out with friends from church. I never explicitly lied to my family about what I was doing. When they asked how I spent my days, I told them I was working part-time for Harold Morrison. When they asked about my evening classes, I said I was taking business courses. But I didn't elaborate and they didn't ask for details. They were so focused on their own lives that they never thought to wonder what mine might contain. David was wrapped up in law school, calling home mainly to ask for money or to share news about his grades and internships. Sarah was busy with her own college experience, working toward her education degree and dating Craig. Michael was navigating high school with the typical self-absorption of a teenager. Robert was supportive in his quiet way. He never questioned my desire to work outside the home, never complained about the evenings I spent at school or the weekend hours I devoted to studying. But he also never asked detailed questions about what I was learning or where I hoped it might lead. Looking back, I think he was relieved that I had found something to occupy my time. By 1992, I had my own clients. Harold had started referring people to me, mostly friends and neighbors who needed help with their taxes but couldn't afford his full fees. I set up a small office in our spare bedroom and began preparing returns during tax season, earning what I thought of as PIN money at the time. But as word spread about my work, the PIN money grew into something more substantial. By 1995, I was earning enough to pay for a kitchen renovation that Robert and I had been discussing for years. By 1998, I had enough clients to require my own business license and liability insurance. That's when I realized I wasn't just helping Harold Morrison anymore. I was running my own business. In 2000, I incorporated as Hartwell Financial Services and moved into a small office downtown, in a renovated Victorian house that had been converted into professional suites. I hired my first employee, a young woman named Jennifer who helped with filing and phone calls during busy periods. Still, my family didn't ask questions. When they noticed the kitchen renovation, I said we'd been saving for it. When I bought a newer car, I explained that the old one had become unreliable. When I mentioned my work in passing, they nodded politely and changed the subject to more interesting topics. David's promotion, Sarah's pregnancy, Michael's latest computer project. I told myself they were just busy with their own lives, that they'd ask for details when they had time. But as the years passed, I began to understand that they weren't going to ask. Not because they were too busy, but because they genuinely weren't interested in the answer. To them, I was mom. I baked cookies and sent birthday cards and asked about their lives during our increasingly brief phone calls. The idea that I might have professional achievements, business success, or expertise in anything beyond child rearing and housekeeping simply didn't occur to them. The invisibility was so complete that I could have told them I was running a multinational corporation and they would have smiled indulgently and asked if I needed help balancing my checkbook. The turning point came in 2005, 2 years before Robert died. I had been asked to speak at a regional conference for small business owners about retirement planning strategies. It was a significant honor, the kind of professional recognition that David regularly received in his law practice, the kind of achievement that Sarah celebrated when it happened to her friends in education. I was excited about the speaking engagement, proud of being selected, nervous about presenting to such a large audience. When the family gathered for Sunday dinner that week, I decided to share my news. "I've been asked to give a presentation at a business conference next month," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. David looked up from his plate. "That's nice, Mom. What kind of presentation?" "About retirement planning strategies for small business owners," I explained. "It's a pretty big conference. They're expecting about 300 attendees." I waited for their reactions, for some sign that they understood this was a professional accomplishment worth celebrating. "That sounds interesting," Sarah said politely, then immediately turned to Craig. "Did you remember to call the pediatrician about James's cough?" Michael was entirely focused on his food. David had already returned his attention to cutting his roast beef. It was as if I had announced I was reorganizing my recipe file. That night, lying in bed next to Robert, I tried to understand why their indifference hurt so much. After all, I wasn't doing this work for their approval. I had my own sense of satisfaction, my own professional relationships, my own growing reputation in the local business community. But they were my children. I wanted them to be proud of me the way I had always been proud of them. The conference went beautifully. My presentation was well received, I made valuable connections with other financial planners, and I came home with 3 new client referrals. When I mentioned this success during our next family gathering, the response was the same polite disinterest. That's when I started to understand that they didn't just fail to see my professional life, they actively dismissed it. The dismissal became more obvious as my business grew. By 2008, I was managing investment portfolios for over 20 clients and had expanded my services to include comprehensive financial planning. I had hired 2 part-time employees and was considering moving to a larger office space. But when I mentioned during a phone call with David that I was having some success with the business, his response was patronizing. "That's great, Mom. It's good that you're keeping busy. Dad always said you were good with numbers." Keeping busy. As if my work was a hobby designed to fill my empty hours rather than a legitimate business that was generating substantial income and serving real clients with significant financial needs. When I tried to explain to Sarah that I was thinking about expanding my office space, she responded with concern rather than congratulations. "Mom, are you sure you're not taking on too much? You're not as young as you used to be." I was 66 years old and in perfect health, managing a business that required complex financial analysis and client relations. But to Sarah, I was an aging woman who might be getting in over her head. Michael's response was the most hurtful of all. When I mentioned during one of our rare phone conversations that I'd been featured in the local business journal for my expertise in retirement planning, he said, "That's cool, Mom," in the same tone he'd used as a teenager when I told him about my garden club activities. Cool. Like it was a cute hobby that didn't merit serious attention. The real breaking point came in 2010, during the financial crisis that had devastated so many families and businesses in our area. Several of my clients had come to me in panic, worried about their retirement savings and investment portfolios. I had spent months helping them navigate the crisis, restructuring their portfolios to minimize losses and taking advantage of opportunities that the market downturn created. My careful planning and conservative strategies had protected my clients from the worst effects of the recession. In fact, most of them had emerged from the crisis in better financial shape than when it began. This success had led to a flood of new clients, people whose own financial advisors had failed them during the downturn. I was busier and more successful than I had ever been. When the family gathered for Christmas that year, I was exhausted but proud. I had guided dozens of families through the worst financial crisis in decades, had literally saved several clients from bankruptcy, and had proven my expertise in ways that even I hadn't fully appreciated before. I thought this might finally be the moment when my children would understand that their mother was more than they had imagined. During dinner, David was discussing the effects of the recession on his law practice. Several of his corporate clients had reduced their legal spending, and his firm had been forced to lay off some staff. "It's been a challenging year," he said. "A lot of people don't understand how complex financial planning really is. I've seen so many families make terrible decisions because they didn't have proper guidance." This was my opening. "Actually," I said, "I've been helping quite a few families navigate the recession. Most of my clients have come through it pretty well because we restructured their portfolios early and focused on conservative strategies. David looked at me with the expression I'd grown to dread, polite interest masking barely concealed condescension. That's great, Mom. I'm sure your little business has been helpful to people. Your little business. At that moment, I understood that it didn't matter how successful I became, how many clients I served, or how much expertise I developed. To my children, I would always be their aging mother playing at business, not a professional worthy of respect. That Christmas dinner was when I started planning what would eventually become the reading that would change everything. The morning of the will reading, I woke up before dawn. I had spent 73 years on this earth, raised 3 children, buried a husband, built a business, and earned the respect of everyone in my professional life. But this would be the first time my children would really, truly see me for who I was. The irony that it would happen in a lawyer's office, with legal documents as my messenger, wasn't lost on me. Sometimes the truth needs a formal setting to be taken seriously. I dressed carefully that morning, with the deliberate attention of a general preparing for battle. Not in the floral blouses and comfortable slacks my children expected to see, the uniform of invisible grandmothers everywhere, but in the navy blue suit I wore to client meetings and speaking engagements. The suit that signaled competence and authority to everyone who wasn't related to me. The fabric was expensive wool that held its shape perfectly, tailored to fit my 73-year-old frame in a way that commanded respect rather than pity. I put on the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, the ones I'd been saving for special occasions for decades, and I looked at myself in the mirror. Today they will know. The woman looking back at me wasn't the frail widow my children saw, the one they worried about living alone and managing her affairs. This was Eleanor Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Financial Services, a woman who had built something significant and lasting, a woman who commanded respect in boardrooms and conference halls. This was who I really was. Patterson had arranged for the reading to take place at 2 p.m. in the main conference room of his law firm. The office building was downtown, in one of those renovated historic buildings that housed the city's most prestigious legal practices. I had been there many times over the years for business meetings, but my children had never seen me in this environment. When I arrived 15 minutes early, Patterson was already there, organizing documents with the careful precision I'd come to appreciate over our years of working together. He was wearing his best suit too, understanding instinctively that this wasn't just a routine reading but a performance designed to shatter assumptions. "Are you ready for this, Eleanor?" he asked, using my first name as he always did in private. "I've been ready for years," I told him. "Maybe my whole life." David arrived first, as I'd known he would. Punctuality was one of his professional virtues, and he treated family obligations with the same efficiency he brought to client meetings. He strode through the door checking his phone, nodded at me with the polite distance I'd grown accustomed to, then took a seat across the conference table as if this were a business meeting that had nothing to do with him personally. In his expensive suit and Italian leather shoes, he looked every inch the successful attorney he'd become. But sitting there in that conference room, he also looked like exactly what he was. A man who had never bothered to really know his own mother. Sarah came next, with Craig in tow for moral support. She kissed my cheek dutifully and asked how I was feeling, but I could see her eyes already calculating, already wondering how quickly this would be over so she could get back to Emma's dance recital preparation and James's soccer tournament. She was wearing the kind of carefully coordinated outfit that suburban mothers perfected, expensive enough to signal success, conservative enough to avoid criticism. Her purse was designer leather, her shoes were sensible but stylish, her jewelry was understated but clearly costly. She looked like a woman who had everything under control, including a simple will reading for her elderly mother. Michael was last, sliding into the room just as Patterson was consulting his watch. He'd flown in from California the day before but hadn't called to see me, hadn't stopped by the house, hadn't made any effort to connect during what he assumed would be his final visit home. He looked uncomfortable in his dress shirt and slacks, like a tech worker playing dress-up for a family obligation. All 3 of my children together in one room for the first time in over 2 years. The occasion was my death, or rather, the legal aftermath of my death, since I was very much alive and sitting right there with them. But in a way they had been treating me as if I were already dead for years. "Thank you all for being here," Patterson began, his voice carrying the formal weight of legal proceedings. "Before we begin with the will itself, Mrs. Hartwell has asked me to share some information that will provide context for her decisions." I watched their faces, polite attention, nothing more. They were waiting for this to be over so they could divide up my modest possessions and get on with their lives. David was probably mentally calculating how much the house might be worth. Sarah was likely wondering if there was enough money to make the inheritance tax worthwhile. Michael just looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. They had no idea what was coming. Mrs. Hartwell, Patterson continued, opening the first folder with theatrical precision, has asked me to begin by explaining the scope of her estate. He pulled out a document that made David sit up straighter, his lawyer's instincts recognizing the official letterhead of a major investment firm. The estate of Eleanor Margaret Hartwell consists of the following assets: the family home and property, valued at $450,000. Investment accounts totaling $2.3 million. Business assets of Hartwell Financial Services, valued at $1.8 million. And various other holdings bringing the total estate value to approximately $4.7 million. The silence in that room was deafening. I watched the shock register on their faces like a slow-motion earthquake. First confusion, surely they had misheard. Then disbelief, this couldn't be right. Then frantic mental calculations as they tried to reconcile the numbers with everything they thought they knew about their mother. David's mouth actually fell open, his professional composure cracking for the first time I could remember. Sarah's hand went to her throat, an unconscious gesture of distress that took me back to her childhood when she was overwhelmed by something too big to understand. Michael leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly, his usual detachment replaced by sharp attention. They were seeing me for the first time in decades. "I'm sorry," David said, his lawyer's training finally kicking in. "Did you say Hartwell Financial Services? I've never heard of any such business." Patterson looked at me and I nodded. This was the moment I had been planning for years. The revelation that would force them to confront everything they had assumed about me. Mrs. Hartwell established Hartwell Financial Services in 1995. Patterson explained with the measured precision of someone delivering life-changing news. Over the past 28 years, she has built it into one of the most successful independent financial planning firms in the region. She currently manages assets worth over $12 million for 43 clients across 3 counties. The truth landed like a physical blow. Sarah was shaking her head like someone trying to wake up from a confusing dream. "That's impossible. Mom she doesn't work. She's never worked, not since we were children." There was the assumption that had shaped their understanding of me for decades. In their minds, I had ceased to exist as a complete person the day I became their mother. Everything I had accomplished since then, every client served, every portfolio managed, every family guided through the financial crisis, had been invisible to them because they couldn't imagine their mother being capable of such things. "Mom," Michael said, his voice strange and tight with emotions I couldn't identify. "What is he talking about?" This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when they would finally have to confront the fact that they had never really known me at all. "Your mother," Patterson continued, opening another folder, "has also asked me to play a video she recorded specifically for this occasion." He turned on the large screen at the end of the conference room, and suddenly my face appeared. Not the aging, invisible mother they saw when they looked at me, but the confident businesswoman I had become. In the video, I was sitting in my office, surrounded by awards and certificates they had never seen, wearing the navy suit that projected competence and success. The office behind me was elegant but professional, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with financial texts and industry publications. On the wall were framed certificates from continuing education courses, awards from professional organizations, and a photograph of me speaking at a conference to an audience of hundreds. This was my world. The world they had never bothered to discover. "My dear children," my recorded voice began, and I could see them struggling to reconcile this authoritative woman on the screen with the mother they thought they knew. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone and you're finally learning who I really was." I watched them watch me, saw the growing recognition that the woman on the screen was someone they had never met. "For the past 30 years, while you were building your important lives and careers, I was building something too. I built a business that employs 6 people and serves clients from 3 counties. I built a reputation for excellence in a field you never knew I understood. I built a life of purpose and achievement that existed completely separate from my role as your mother." David was staring at the screen as if it were showing him an alien creature. His face had gone pale and I could see him trying to process decades of assumptions that were crumbling in real time. "I tried to share this part of my life with you," The video continued and I saw Sarah wince as if the words were physical blows. I tried to tell you about my work, my clients, my successes. But you weren't interested in hearing about the achievements of a simple grandmother who baked cookies and tended her garden. Sarah was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks as she finally understood what she had been dismissing all these years. I want you to understand that this isn't about money, my video self continued, leaning forward slightly as if speaking directly to each of them. This is about the fact that you stopped seeing me as a complete person years ago. You saw me as an obligation, a responsibility, someone whose life had no value beyond what I could provide for you. Michael had turned away from the screen, his shoulders tense with what I recognized as shame. He was staring out the window at the parking lot, but I could see his reflection in the glass, and his face was twisted with emotions he was trying not to feel. This was harder to watch than I had expected. The video went on for 20 more minutes, methodically dismantling every assumption they had made about my life since Robert died. I showed them my office, introduced them to my employees who spoke about their respect and affection for me, walked them through client success stories that demonstrated the scope and impact of my work. I showed them awards I had won, conferences where I had been a keynote speaker, articles I had written for industry publications. I introduced them to the woman who had been living parallel to their perception of me for decades. Successful, respected, intellectually engaged, professionally accomplished. It was a life they had never imagined, achievements they had never suspected, a version of their mother that was completely foreign to them. When the video ended, the silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of recognition and regret. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, why didn't you tell us? The question I had been waiting decades for someone to ask. I tried, I said simply, my voice calm despite the emotions churning inside me. But you were never interested in listening. Resolution. The will reading that followed was unlike anything my children could have imagined. Because once they understood who I really was, not just their aging mother but a successful businesswoman with substantial assets and a reputation that extended far beyond their limited perception, they had to reckon with how they had treated that person for decades. They had to confront the fact that they had been dismissing someone extraordinary. The distributions I had planned were not about punishment exactly but about teaching. About making them understand that actions have consequences, even when those actions are neglect and dismissal spread over years. About forcing them to experience in some small way what it felt like to be overlooked and undervalued. Patterson continued reading from the carefully crafted document that had taken us months to perfect. To my son David, he read, who has always been too busy for phone calls and visits, I leave the family home, with the condition that he can only sell it if he first spends 1 full month living there alone, without his family or any electronic devices, experiencing the solitude I have lived with for years. I watched David's face as he processed this. The house was worth nearly $500,000, but the condition meant he would have to step away from his busy, important life for an entire month. He would have to sit in the silence I had been sitting in, feel the loneliness I had been feeling, understand what it meant to be disconnected from the people who should matter most. Furthermore, Patterson continued, during this month, David must call one elderly person each day, a client from Hartwell Financial Services who has graciously agreed to participate, and have a conversation of at least 30 minutes about their life, their experiences and their perspective. These calls will be monitored to ensure genuine engagement. David looked like he had been struck. I could see him calculating the professional cost of being unavailable for a month, the clients he would have to reschedule, the income he would lose. But more than that, I could see him beginning to understand what I had been trying to tell him for years. That relationships require time and attention, that love cannot be efficiently managed. To my daughter Sarah, Patterson read next, who has gradually excluded me from her children's lives, I leave a trust fund for Emma and James' college educations, totaling $800,000, with the stipulation that Sarah must write them a letter every week for 1 full year, explaining what it feels like to be slowly made invisible by people you love. Sarah's crying intensified, but I could see understanding dawning in her eyes. She would have to find words for the experience she had put me through, would have to articulate to her children what it meant to be dismissed and marginalized by your own family. Additionally, Patterson continued, Sarah must spend 4 hours each week for the next year volunteering with elderly residents at Millbrook Senior Center, listening to their stories and learning about their lives before they became just old people. I had chosen that consequence carefully. Sarah needed to understand that elderly people, people like me, had full, rich lives that extended far beyond their roles as grandparents and great-grandparents. She needed to see older adults as complete human beings rather than responsibilities to be managed. To my son Michael, Patterson read, his voice growing more solemn, who has disappeared from my life entirely, I leave the business, Hartwell Financial Services, with the requirement that he move back home for 2 years to learn how to run it, to understand the work I have been doing while he was building his important life in California. Michael's head snapped around from the window, his face a mixture of shock and dismay. Inheriting the business meant inheriting responsibility not just for assets but for people. The employees who depended on the company, the clients who trusted us with their financial futures. Michael will work directly with my current staff, Patterson continued, learning every aspect of the business from client relations to investment strategy. He must successfully complete certification courses in financial planning and demonstrate competence in all areas of operation before he can assume full ownership. This was the consequence that had taken me the longest to design. Michael had spent years avoiding responsibility to family, building a life that required nothing from him except technical skills and self-interest. Now he would have to learn what it meant to be responsible for other people's welfare, to understand that success wasn't just about personal achievement but about service to others. Furthermore, Patterson added, if any of the 3 children choose not to fulfill these conditions, their inheritance will be donated to local charities that serve elderly residents and single mothers building businesses. This wasn't just about the money, it was about forcing them to experience what they had put me through. But I wasn't finished yet. There is one more component to Mrs. Hartwell's will, Patterson said, consulting his notes with the dramatic timing we had rehearsed. A video message specifically for this moment. Another video began, this one recorded just weeks earlier in my living room. The same room where I had spent so many lonely evenings waiting for phone calls that never came, where I had celebrated professional achievements alone because my children were too busy to share in my success. My children, my recorded voice said, and I could see them struggling to focus through their tears and shock. If you're watching this, you now understand who you've been ignoring all these years. You understand that while you were seeing me as a burden, I was actually living a full, successful, meaningful life that you never bothered to discover. I watched their faces as they absorbed this truth, the scope of their dismissal, the completeness of their blindness. But here's what I want you to know. This isn't how our story has to end. On the screen I smiled, not the polite, accommodating smile they were used to, but the confident smile of a woman who had finally found her voice. The will you just heard is real and legally binding. But it's also conditional. You have 1 year to contest it, not in court but in life. 1 year to show me that you can see me as I really am. 1 year to demonstrate that you value my presence, my thoughts, my experiences, my contributions to this world. The room was completely silent now. Even Patterson was listening intently, though he'd helped me craft this plan. If, at the end of that year, you can honestly say that you've learned to see me as a complete person rather than just your aging mother, then we'll tear up this will and write a new one. One that reflects the relationship we should have had all along. I was giving them a chance to choose differently. But you need to understand, the video continued, that this isn't about making token efforts or managing me more efficiently. This is about a genuine relationship. This is about actually caring who I am and what my life has meant, not just what I can provide for you. I watched my children absorb this possibility, that their inheritance wasn't just money and property, but the chance to truly know their mother for the first time. The choice is yours, my final recorded words said. You can accept this will as it stands and live with the knowledge that you never really knew me. Or you can spend the next year learning who I am, and discovering that the woman you've been dismissing is someone worth knowing. The screen went dark and we all sat in the weighted silence of possibility. David was the first to speak, his voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it in decades. Mom, he said, and I could hear 30 years of assumptions crumbling in that one word. I don't understand how I. He couldn't finish the sentence, but I could see him trying to process decades of willful blindness, years of conversations where he'd dismissed my attempts to share my real life with him. The successful attorney who could argue complex cases in front of judges was struggling to find words for his own failure as a son. Sarah was crying openly now, not the polite tears of social occasions but the raw grief of genuine recognition. We thought your life was just. Just what? I asked gently, though I knew the answer. Just cooking and cleaning and waiting for your phone calls? Michael stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to all of us. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager dealing with his first heartbreak. Face, Mom. Jesus Christ. We've been such assholes. It wasn't the most eloquent apology I'd ever heard, but it was the most honest. That afternoon marked the beginning of something I had never expected to experience. The slow, careful process of my children learning to see me as a person rather than just their mother. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't easy. There were awkward phone calls and stilted visits where we all struggled to figure out how to talk to each other without the old patterns of dismissal and distance. David would call and ask about my business, but I could hear him struggling to find the right questions, fighting decades of habit that told him his mother's activities weren't really important. Sarah brought Emma and James to visit, not for the rushed, managed encounters we'd grown accustomed to, but for long afternoons where I could show them my office, explain what I did for work, let them see their grandmother as someone who existed beyond their narrow experience of family roles. Michael moved home. Actually moved home, giving up his job in San Francisco and the life he'd built there. For the first month, he barely spoke to me, going through the motions of learning the business with obvious resentment. But gradually, as he began to understand the complexity of what I'd built, the respect I'd earned, the lives I'd impacted, something shifted. Mom, he said one day about 3 months into his return, this client file shows you helped the Hendersons avoid bankruptcy during the 2008 crisis. You literally saved their house. It was the first time he'd ever acknowledged my professional competence as something real and valuable. The year I had given them became the foundation for a completely different relationship. Not the relationship of my dreams. Too much damage had been done for that, too many years of willful blindness couldn't be simply erased. But something real and honest and built on mutual respect rather than mere obligation. They learned to see me. David discovered that his mother had insights into economics and business that rivaled his own professional knowledge. He started asking my opinion on investment strategies, seeking my advice on client relations, actually listening when I spoke instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Sarah learned that her children's grandmother was someone worth knowing, not just someone to be managed. Emma and James began calling me to talk about school and friends and their plans for the future. Real conversations rather than the stilted exchanges we'd endured for years. Michael found that running a business required skills he'd never developed in his tech career. Empathy, patience, the ability to truly listen to other people's concerns and fears. He had to learn what it meant to be responsible for something larger than his own career advancement. And in seeing me, they learned something about themselves too. They learned how easy it is to stop really looking at the people closest to you, how comfortable assumptions can become walls that separate you from the people you claim to love. They learned that love without attention isn't really love at all, just a convenient label for emotional laziness. Now 2 years later, my children call me regularly. Not because they have to, but because they want to. They ask my advice on business decisions and personal challenges. They include me in their planning and their problems and their celebrations. More importantly, they listen when I answer. The will is still there, unchanged in Patterson's files. We've never torn it up and written a new one because in some ways it serves as a reminder, to all of us, of how completely you can misunderstand the people you think you know best. My story isn't a fairy tale. The years of invisibility left scars that will never fully heal. There are still moments when I see my children struggling to reconcile the mother they thought they knew with the woman I actually am. There are still times when old patterns of dismissal surface, when they catch themselves treating me like their aging mother rather than the accomplished professional I've always been. But it is a story of resurrection. Of a woman who refused to disappear, even when the people who should have valued her most made it clear they couldn't see her. Of children who learned, almost too late, that their assumptions had blinded them to someone extraordinary. It's a story about the radical act of insisting on being known, about the courage required to force recognition from people who have grown comfortable ignoring you. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that it's never too late to truly see the people in your life. To look beyond your assumptions and discover who they really are. To choose curiosity over comfort, presence over efficiency, love over convenience. My children thought they knew their simple grandmother, the woman who baked cookies and asked too many questions about their lives. They had no idea they were ignoring one of the most remarkable women they would ever have the chance to know. The woman they finally discovered was me. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.